And it's now time for our panel. Please welcome Lisa Lacasse, President of American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, and Gary Puckrein. He's the President and CEO of the National Minority Quality Forum. Gary is a prominent advocate for diversity and inclusion in clinical trials, and Lisa would like to see more cancer patients have access to these trials. With that, let's get started. Thank you both for joining us. Lisa, I want to start with you, but Gary, you're going to get a chance to answer this one also. Let's set the scene here. What are some of the biggest barriers to folks getting involved and taking part in these clinical trials?
Yeah, so first, thank you so much. This is such an important topic. I appreciate being here. So I think that there are three major categories of barriers. One is that the clinical trials aren't necessarily happening, at least cancer clinical trials aren't happening where the cancer patients actually are. So it creates a barrier for people to know about the trial and then actually be able to enroll on the trial because it's not close to them geographically. There's medical challenges and non-medical challenges that create cost barriers. So you may need to drive for a distance. You may need to stay overnight. Those are expenses that maybe people can't afford, and therefore they are disincentivized to enroll on a trial. And that is particularly true for lower income housing households, some socioeconomic households, and then obviously our rural populations that don't have easy access to hospital systems. So it's very multifactorial, but it is, as we know, clinical trials are so important to our ability to reduce disease burden and certainly to reduce the cancer burden nationwide.
Gary, I want to get your take on this also. From your vantage point, what are some of the biggest barriers to participation in these clinical trials?
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to talk on this issue. It's absolutely critical. One of the challenges, certainly for diverse populations in terms of participating in clinical trials, is getting asked to participate in the clinical trial. Quite frequently, they're not even invited to participate in clinical trials. And then it depends on the type of trial you're talking about, but not well thought about and talked about is also the fact that in diverse populations, you have a large uninsured population. And so PIs are concerned that if they invite a participant into a clinical trial and they discover some abnormality, how do they follow up with care? So besides the list that Lisa provided, and she's absolutely right on those points, I would add those two, that first of all, we've got to make sure that people get asked. And then the second part of it is that for those who are medically underinsured, how do we take care of them and encourage PIs and sponsors of trials to bring them in?
And Lisa, I cover Congress, so for me, everything always comes back to Capitol Hill. What could Congress do to alleviate some of these issues that you laid out and to sort of increase participation in these clinical trials, given how important they could be?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I'm happy to say that there is a bill that we're hoping will be introduced very soon called the Clinical Trials Modernization Act. Apologies for having to spit out that title. And it really is addressing the barriers that both Gary and I just highlighted, which is allowing trial participants to get some financial support to actually enroll in a clinical trial. We know how important finances are, and so this bill would allow for some direct financial support. It would ensure that direct financial support is not taxable income, which becomes very important. Also, it allows for ensuring that the trials themselves are much more accessible. So elevating the ability for a trial to execute through telemedicine, for example, providing maybe an iPad or some wearable medical devices as part of the trial itself. So it's really addressing the design of the trial and making it easier for enrollment and also reducing the cost barriers. So we are eager for our two representatives, Representative Ruiz and Pfluger, to introduce that bill. And I believe there's another bill that we are waiting on, maybe with a couple of members of Congress that you are going to be talking with, also related to financial support. And so we know cost barriers are very, very critical to people's ability to say, yes, I would like to enroll in a clinical trial if they are asked. And so Congress can make a big difference in lowering barriers to clinical trials with both of these approaches legislatively.
I'm going to have to ask around about this when I'm back in the Capitol. Gary, a similar question for you. What can be done to increase diversity in these clinical trials in terms of who's participating in them?
I think probably the most important thing that I would point out, certainly to members of Congress and their staff, that when it comes to healthcare policy and financing, everybody has to follow the science. There is no safe harbor, there's no escape valve. And so clinical trials are incredibly important to add to that, to add to the science, because it is not just for the innovative therapies or devices that help us live long, happy lives, but it also informs clinical guidelines, the practice of medicine. So clinical trials are foundational to everything that we do in healthcare. And we're diverse. Our bodies act differently. And so in order to make sure that we're providing quality care to all Americans, you have to get them into clinical studies. And financial barriers ought not to be an issue here, because if you start with limited access to clinical trials, it means limited information that's going to be needed in order to provide quality care for everyone. So I think members of Congress and their staff have a really important job to do, which is to make sure that our clinical trials are as diverse as possible.
I want to bring.
I'd like to just echo.
Please.
Can I just echo what Gary is saying? Because our progress in the fight against disease is all about getting actual evidence, and it is so the only way to do that for new standards of care, new guidelines as it relates to maybe screening or prevention is through clinical trials. And so making those clinical trials representative is so important. Right now, the statistic is about 2/3 of clinical trials in the United States are actually have enrollees from other countries. And so we know older Americans, rural Americans, certain racial and ethnic populations are not able to enroll because of the barriers that we've articulated. And therefore, the data that's coming out on the other side of these trials are not representative of who we are as in the United States.
I want to stick with this theme for a second, bring in some current events. We're officially past the 100-day mark of the Trump administration's second term. One of the themes has been this rollback of diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, going against DEI. Gary, I'm curious, do these initiatives at all impact diversity and participation for these clinical trials? And if they do, walk us through that. What does that exactly look like?
So to be honest with you, I'm not sure I understand what DEI is, to be really honest. In the world of science, we work with definitions. They are well thought through because what we're trying to get to is predictability. We're trying to understand how to keep populations healthy. And so, we need to be very, very careful with our language and what we're measuring and all of those sorts of things. The point I want to really stress, and it was something that Lisa was saying, in the world of cancer, we are starting to write the last chapter on the war of cancer. If you look at the science and technology that is becoming available to us, it means that we are going to be able to control cancer, certainly over the next 25, 30 years. But in order to do that, we have to have diversity. And so when we get into this language about, it becomes important that we're very, very clear because it's impacting funding, it's impacting the way in which we participate in community. And I think really where our minds need to be set on is that we have the capacity to write the last chapter in the war on cancer. There's nobody in the 20th century that could ever say that. And why we're not paying absolute attention to that and making the investment in it is a question that really needs to be put before all of us. And let's get that job done.
Lisa, I want to bring in a current events question for you as well. Another theme of the first 100 days of the Trump administration has been cutting back on federal spending in a lot of different areas, including investments in some medical research. How has that impacted clinical trials, if at all? And if you can walk us through that.
Yeah, so look, the biomedical research ecosystem is kind of how we say it, is critically important to our ability to learn new things, create new therapies, augment people's understanding of what their risk may be. And so all of that is all part of an ecosystem. And the reduction in federal investment, both at the NIH through the National Cancer Institute, many institutes there, as well as those dollars go into our universities and hospital systems across the country. And also need to highlight the funds that go into the CDC, which support cancer control programs. These are really critical federal investments. They have been investments for decades that have resulted in the United States having the best cancer outcomes, some of the best cancer outcomes in the entire world. And so our very, very heightened concern is that the lack of those federal resources, there are not other parts of the biomedical research ecosystem that can fill those gaps. And so we are extraordinarily concerned with the impact that these reductions will have. And ultimately, many clinical trials, cancer clinical trials, are funded through the NIH and NCI. And so those dollars being significantly reduced will have an impact at the end of the day in the number of clinical trials that are able to be run in the United States, and therefore the number of people who can enroll on those trials. So the very direct impact.
I was doing
like
research.
If you don't mind,
yeah, please,
I'd like to, follow up on that DEI question for a second, because it is important. What would anticipate and what we normally see when government is setting standards, you go to the federal registry and there's a definition of terms that have been well thought through. There's a whole committee that comes to work and defines that. We don't see that here. And so what's happening is that each agency is kind of defining DEI, and then outside, everybody is changing their language and behavior in anticipation as if they understand what we mean by DEI. So I think some formalism, if you will, is really important here. That if we're going to use terms like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, then we need to get something in the federal registry that helps us understand precisely what's being done, because funding is being impacted by this, programs are being impacted by this, lives are being impacted by this. So I think clarity is probably really important.
Fascinating. Look, we're running out of time, guys, but there was one more question I really wanted to ask. I was doing research for this conversation, and I read that there are only 5% of Americans actually participate in clinical trials. It just feels like such a small number. So we only have about 2 minutes left, but I want to give you both a chance to respond. What is the driving factor behind that number being so low? And what's the top thing on your list that could expand that number and help it grow? Lisa, we'll start with you.
So for cancer clinical trials specifically, they are just not being offered where that cancer patient actually is. So the vast majority of clinical trials are at phenomenal NCI designated cancer centers, really, really important institutions. But 80% of cancer patients actually get their care in community health settings. They are not in those big academic medical centers. And so we've got to bring the trials to where the patients are, and that will help significantly.
And Gary, I want to get you in on this as well. Just 5% of Americans, such a staggeringly small number.
I agree with Lisa's point. I think we have to bring our trials into community. What we want is our clinical trials to be an option as part of routine care, that your doctor is able to say to you, here's an opportunity that you might want to explore. Right now, we have not taken that infrastructure that Lisa's talking about and driven it right to the community. So we need to build our logistical systems so that we can actually do clinical trials in community, particularly when you're talking in rural community. I know we haven't talked a lot about that. Big time problem in rural communities, and how we make sure that folks who live in rural communities also have access to clinical trials.
Yeah, so clinical trial design and cost barriers are probably the most important interventions that would increase enrollment.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Fascinating conversation. Lisa Lacasse, Gary Puckrein, thank you both so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And with that, we've reached the end of the program. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers for taking part in the conversation. On behalf of The Hill and our sponsor, Eli Lilly, thank you all to you for taking part in the conversation and joining us. Now, if you missed parts of the event, don't worry. They're going to be available online on our website and on our social media platforms. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.